We're here to talk about a poem by Patrick Rosal, and it's called Uptown Ode that ends on an ode to the Machete. It's from a book of poems that's published in 2016 called Brooklyn Antediluvian. It's actually in all of ModPo, at least the time of this recording, the most contemporary poem that we're talking about. In Brooklyn Antediluvian, we encounter this poem, which is divided distinctly into two parts. So we'll talk about those two parts. But the first part is written in a kind of frenetic, and I think I would say not happy, but ecstatic, excited, energetic, present tense. So can anyone, maybe Connie, just say in the most basic way what you think is literally going on? What is the scene?
Probably towards the night, there's traveling going on. The author or the narrator and Willie are just, going across the city, across the bridge, to a bar, dancing.
Mm-hmm.
There's that frenetic energy.
Is it just the speaker and Willie?
It seems like people are joining them or coming in.
I think Orlando has joined them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kamar, do we know where they are?
East Side, Franklin and Fulton. I know Tito Puente was from Spanish Harlem, so maybe
El Barrio.
El Barrio, yeah.
So that's AKA Spanish Harlem or East Harlem.
Yeah.
So they're going uptown, it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Lily, we've got an energetic, present tense, men going dancing. This must remind you of another poetics, an earlier poetics.
Yes, it sounds like Franco Harris, The Old Place.
Mm-hmm. At the Old Place, in particular. But what more generally about OHara do you see here?
We're not going any particular place. We're kind of just weaving in and out as though we were at a party behind one person's shoulder.
Mm-hmm. And Anna, it's not even 5 past midnight in El Barrio, and I'm nodding to Jibo, spinning one ill cut after another. Well, there's another OHara poem that we encounter in ModPo that this reminds you of, don't you think?
Well, it's got that kind of classic OHara, New York school, I do this, I do that kind of style.
There it does,
reminds me of the beginning of The Day Lady Died.
Or even the end,
Or
when they're
the
in a
end,
nightclub.
sure. Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, like the whole poem. I mean, it's this kind of motion sort of through the city,
Yeah.
But I think what Rosal's bringing to this is there's like, I know OHara is sort of anti-narrative, but Rosal kind of updates that anti-narrative with the kind of simultaneity. Like these things are all happening at once, where he says, don't take 3 minutes for me and Will to jump on the dance floor or post up at the bar sipping on barlito or to tap on my glass. He's like, the or instead of the and that OHara would use makes all these things kind of happen with this like charged simultaneous energy.
Carlos, I'm gonna ask an obvious question, but I think it's really important. How else is Patrick Rosal being different from? This is a New York poem. It's in New York, but it's a different New York from Franco Harris' New York. No?
Yeah. Well, it's very textured by immigrant culture, and it has such a. I mean, Frank OHara can be very musical, but I think that this poem has such a sonic quality to it and such a condensed, heated rhythm that I think is
that almost matches the different kind of music that he's referring to.
When we listen to it, it's very ba-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. It sounds almost like it's a drum, actually. Like his voice sounds like a drum, and the words going out. I was just underlining while he was saying some of the words that stuck out to me. The verbs specifically, like the flies from Franklin, the zip up the east side, the knocking to Esther Williams. Not only it was the performance very percussive, but the language itself, especially the verbs.
So there's very little in the way of I ams. The I am does da-dum. This is up the east side, right, over the bridge, up the east side. So we get much more of a series of unstressed syllables, and then we lead to some beats. So it's almost scored by Tito Puente in a way. So we have a general sense of the importance of Spanish culture, and Filipinos' relationship with Spanish is complicated, but anything else to add? I mean, Connie, you said Diaspora. Is that apparent in the first section?
Well, I think because in maybe the New York school poetics, the demotic language and the reference to the objects is really important. Here, even more so, maybe they seem like artifacts or a way to connect to something that's lost, and there's that, I think, a sense of going back or a sense of, the importance of these objects that we get here.
Lily and Kamara, can we add one more factor before we go to the next section, which is there's OHara-like homosociality here. These are guys who are dancing with each other, just as in OHara's at the old place. Anything to say of significance about that? Lily, you first.
Well, we get at the very end of this section. He goes from calling, I'm assuming it's the same person, calling his friend, or maybe it's actually his brother, Willie, to Dear Brother Will, all capitalized. So we could interpret that a few different ways. Like the all capitalizations makes it seem like this is a title that he holds.
Yeah.
Or it could mean he calls him by a name that he translated to English as Dear Brother Will, all caps, or maybe it was like a term of endearment that wouldn't translate, something like that. But like very clearly underscoring that this statement that Dear Brother Will is about to make isn't to be taken lightly. Like it is dear, just like the relationship that they have with each other.
So let's just assume that Lily is right about Will, who has maybe a special relationship, because the others may be, in fact, they may be from all parts of what makes up the El Barrio, what makes up Spanish Harlem, Latin American, Central American, Filipino, but Brother Will seems to have a special thing he wants to say as a result of this great experience that the motley flock is having. And Anna, how would you paraphrase that? We are all trying to get home. Good luck.
I would say it's the kind of push and pull of that immigrant experience, of the places where you can sort of maintain your contact to your culture and tradition, and yet also participate in being part of the motley flock. So maybe like him saying this, and especially if you listen to the reading, he really, like, this is the moment, this is the gravitas moment, really, which stands in such a wonderful contrast to the energy that we were talking about at the beginning of this discussion. That makes you sort of pause and think about actually what that struggle, or what that, I guess sometimes it's a struggle, maybe sometimes it can be tremendously kind of empowering. Existing with one foot in each.
I'm going to jump ahead briefly. When he uses the word duende, it's really appropriate to this poem.
Can you explain?
So duende, I think, has a couple of different meanings depending on how you learn about it, but it's either like the spirituality of a place, a landscape, which comes from, I think, primarily Latin culture, or kind of the spirituality or sense of aura in a piece of art, the poetic landscape or artistic landscape. And there's so many layers in this poem, because there's the poetic landscape of the poem and the duende that we're sort of reading, and then there's this kind that these people are sort of trying to create in this dense, heated moment of music and kind of connecting.
But far away from some origin.
And far away from their origins, which is another landscape they're sort of trying to travel to
reproduce it in the motley flock. Right, but then that inevitably makes Will think, wait a minute, what we're really doing here is we're all trying to get home. One of the advantages of using the present tense, which is a style, is that when you get to we are all trying to get home, you continue the present tense. And in fact, in doing all this present tense uptown, downtown movement and dancing and integration of cultures and creation of a motley flock, you are in that trying to get home. It's not as if now we will say that in a general present we are all trying to get home. So it has a greater power because of it. Okay, so the second half of the poem seems to be the second ode. The first ode is the Uptown Ode, and now it ends, in fact, more than 50% of it becomes an ode to the Machete. So it begins with that powerful line that I think Connie referred to, allow me to translate. Lily?
I think he's very clearly signaling who he expects his audience to be, meaning someone to whom this experience from the first section would not be familiar at all.
Right. So Brother Will has said this to me, and now I turn to you in this ode, and the second ode, and say, I think I want to explain what this means.
But I actually think like it's complicated, and I don't know that it's super clear from reading the second section at first, whether he's translating all of only what Will said, we are all trying to get home, or if he's translating the entire first paragraph, like which part of the first stanza, which part of the first stanza are we supposed to be able to graph onto this second
So
paragraph?
that is a key ambiguity. Am I translating what Will just told me, or am I translating this entire scene? And to do so, I need to go somewhere else.
One of the first things to notice is that it differs so much from the first section in, tempo, and also in the syntax, I guess. Allow me to translate. There's some sort of implicit didacticism. But then also you have images that come...
In that next line, there are neighborhoods in America. It sounds like a mini lecture.
Right, right.
Yeah.
There's something about the machete that is a tool that is not only violent. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a very because you can use it for so many different things, it becomes a very complex image that both references many different uses and then many different cultures in the poem.
To me, what made me sort of think that the second section is actually a translation of the entire first section is the way that these
Which is, by the way, let me pause, a really interesting idea.
Oh, thank you.
No, but can you say a little more about that?
Sure,
What
yeah.
if the second ode?
Thank you.
What if the second ode is a kind of mirror?
What made me think it? Two things. One was he mentions the law of moving bodies, which I thought was like Newton's laws of
yes, it's a
bodies
pun
in
on
motion.
physics and diaspora.
So I thought
moving bodies.
famously that a law is for every action there's an equal but opposite reaction. So I thought maybe he was intending to kind of say, even though he's describing dancing, I thought it was kind of
the dance floor.
an idea of here's this section and maybe presented in this environment, it's got an equal but opposite translation.
There's a real shift to me in kind of the groundedness of the first section, which has these kind of it has the objects that we talked about, the artifacts, it has people, it's got names, it has directions, it has movement that we can sort of anchor, okay, they went from here to here. But the second section has an almost kind of magical, realistic sort of quality to it. We know he's going back to a real place, he's making a pilgrimage, he's looking at the process by which some of these things are made, but there is a kind of almost a dreamier quality to it.
It's an origin story, right?
Yeah.
To the exact place where, right? And then you have fire and embers and making things. This is the machete, not as a symbol, but as an actual tool. This is where it's forged.
I wanted to talk about religion and rites and traditions in this passage because I think that's the most the biggest content change for me is that after this first section of kind of fun and dancing and the city life of New York City, we get back to this origin story that is rooted in diablos and rites and weeping and black saints and disgruntled angels, which for me says something about if this part is a translation of this, then there must be something also holy or devilish in this as well, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's really powerful and beautiful.
I'm getting feeling excited about discovering yet again from Patrick Rosal what we know about American music. Let's say from New Orleans, for instance, to take a different mode, which is that all American music is essentially created from the diaspora, from horrific, forced diasporic bodies moving. Okay, so now let's turn to the last section, which I will read, and I'll invite each of you to say something about. Now we are not in Franco Harris' New York anymore, Toto. We are not in that style. We are not in that present tense. And now he's becoming a little more formalistic and creating a triad of what hard is. When I was young, I thought hard was the mad dog you could send across a crowded bar. I thought hard was how deep you roll or how nasty the steel you bring. In some neighborhoods of America, hard is turning down the fire just enough so you can kiss the knife and make it ring.
In a way, this retranslating of hard sort of forgives the youth, or forgives the youthful definition of what heart is. And
what is the youthful definition of heart?
Just macho, having, like, bearing a weapon, or doing
cutting
something.
and knifing and military.
Right.
Lily, I'm just going to throw you a little curveball and ask you to try to give us some meanings of hard.
It can mean hardened against the world, like you are self-contained and strong.
That's one.
Yeah.
Another one?
It can mean unbreakable, like it's hard and maybe just can't, as opposed to soft.
Another one?
Stiff, so not malleable.
Yes, and that refers back to the forging of the, right? It's all about making the metal not hard during the forging, so that you can create something that is very hard.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's one more.
Difficult, like hard to parse.
Yeah, I think this poem ultimately is about a complicated history of machismo. Like complicating it, tempering it, turning down the fire, so that when we see these guys dancing in Spanish Harlem, we think maybe something that is more complicated going on among this male ritualizing.
Yeah, it's kind of a shift from sort of an enacting into a making. Like, instead of using the tool to enact violence or to sort of roil your way across the room like a mad dog, it's a shift towards focusing on the making of that tool and sort of the
making and
the
teaching
using
culture,
of all these
right?
different of fire and steel and earth and sort of the human coming together to make these things, and kind of the connectivity of that making rather than the use.
Terrific.
I think based on the concept of translating and what we talked about before about how it seems to signal that he expects his audience to be one that's not familiar with this particular experience, I think we're kind of, at least I took that to mean he's asking us to, if we see this scene in our own lives, to read this this like complicated journey of masculinity and complicated like diasporic identity in the people that we see, and not to just assume that's just some guys having a night out. Like like what Kamara was saying, there's a rite and a ritual and a something really important to what these guys that you might sort of cast aside or walk by and not think about what they're doing.
Carlos, final thought, final word?
Sure. I'd just like to say that has such a command of pace. Just like such an incredible command of pace, moving from the first long stanza with very few periods and punctuations, and it just kind of runs through densely together, and then it's tempered again in the second one, sort of shortening itself down into these more declarative sentences that kind of echo off each other, especially the last three, into like a kind of ringing for me that I just thought he did really well.
I would say that I am absolutely all for a poetry that seeks to complicate any of these notions of masculinity, diaspora, machetes, any or all of the above. That's what I'm looking for, especially when I'm the audience that needs these things translated for me, because this hasn't been my experience.
The next time I see someone named Jibo spinning one ill cut, notice the cut there, because this is about Machete, the cutlass, one ill cut after another, I'm not going to think simply, that's someone I should be afraid of, that's someone who is inherently violent. I'm going to say, well, there's probably a complicated cultural story about this ill cut dance.
I was just going to say that, like, going back to the title, an Uptown Ode that ends on an ode to the machete. If you looked at that title without reading the rest of the poem, you'd think this poem would be about, like, violence and, you would see some relation between New York and someplace else, but you would think violent. But learning about origins and learning about diasporic histories, things like that, you can find some type of peace in that.
The only real violence in the poem that we encounter is the physics of the diaspora, the first and last law of moving bodies. Right? I mean, that's what's happening here. That's what's happened. That's how America, he uses the word America, not United States, that's how America is constituted the law of moving bodies, and that the best sanctuary for such moving bodies, bodies that have been moved, is the dance floor. That's what he says, that the dance floor is a sanctuary. And that makes me deeply moved by the experience of the first section in retrospect when I reread it. So the book is by Patrick Rosal, R-O-S-A-L, and it's called Brooklyn Antediluvian, and I think everyone at this table is going to buy it as soon as it's available. Thank you very much, all of you.